Well, just like always, we're here. We're here around the campfire. I see the regulars. That's comforting to see. We got a good fire going. Finally, it's cold enough to run this thing full on. And I'm trying out something kind of fun here. Got some Irish cream. Man, that's kind of fun. A little coffee, and then I'll have a little Irish cream, and then I might even have a little coffee with Irish cream. But to move on, we got The Seventh Man, book 3 of the Untamed. You know, we've been reading that for a while now, and it's a pretty good little story. And we're getting to where sheriff's building a posse. You know the story. That's where we've been, and that's where we are tonight, chapter 27. The chapter 27 is The Sixth Man. Now, I don't want to put you out none, said the applicant gently. His voice was extremely gentle, and there was about him all the shrinking aloofness of the naturally timid. The deputy looked him over with quiet amusement. Slender fellow, with the gentlest brown eyes, and then, with a quick side glance, invited the crowd to get in on the joke. "Oh, you ain't put me out," he assured the other. "Not if you pay for your own ammunition." "Oh, yes," answered the would-be manhunter. I reckon I can afford that." He was so serious about it that the crowd murmured its amusement instead of bursting out with loud laughter. If the man was a fool, at least he was not aggressive in his folly. They gave way. He walked slowly towards the counter and stepped into that little open space beside the master of ceremonies. Very obviously, he was ill at ease to find himself the center of so much attention. "I suppose you've been practicing up on tin cans?" suggested the deputy, leaning on the counter. "Sometimes I hit things, and sometimes I don't," answered the stranger. "Well," and this was put more crisply as the deputy brought out a large pad of paper. "Just give me your name, pardner." "Joe Cumber." He grew still more ill at ease. "I hear that even if you hit the mark, you got to talk to the sheriff himself afterwards?" "Yep." The applicant sighed. "Why do you ask?" "I ain't much on words." "But hell with your gun, eh?" The sheriff grinned again, but while the other turned his head towards him, his smile went out. Suddenly, while the wrinkle of mirth still lay in his cheek, a deputy stroked his chin and looked thoughtful. "Get your gun ready," he ordered. The other slipped his hand down to his gun butt and moved his weapon to make sure that it was perfectly loose in the leather. "Ain't you going to take your gun out?" queried the deputy. "Can I do that?" I reckon not," said the deputy, and looked that stranger straight in his eyes. His change to deadly earnestness put a hush over the crowd. Across the target, not tossed easily as it had been for Pop Guserberg, but literally thrown, darted the line of white, while the gun flipped out of its holster as if it possessed a life of its own, and it spoke. The white line ended halfway to the farther side of the target, and the revolver slid again into hiding. A clamor of amazement broke from the crowd, but the deputy looked steadily, without enthusiasm, at the stranger. "Joe Cumber," he said when the noise fell away a little, "I guess you'll see the sheriff. Harry, take Joe Cumber up to Pete, will you?" One of the bystanders jumped at the suggestion and led the other from the room, with a full half of the crowd following. A deputy remained thoughtful behind. "What's the matter?" asked one of the specters. "You look like you seen a ghost." "Gents," answered the deputy, "do any of you recollect seeing this feller before?" They did not. "They's something queer about him," muttered the deputy. He may be word-shy," proffered a wit, "but he sure ain't gun-shy." "Well, when he looked at me," said the deputy, more to himself than to the others, "it seemed to me like they was a swirl of yaller come into his eyes. Made me feel like someone had sneaked up behind me with a knife." In his thoughtfulness his eyes wandered, and wandering they fell upon the notice of the reward for the capture, dead or alive, of Daniel Barry, about 5 feet 9 or 10, slender, with black hair and brown eyes. "My God!" cried the deputy. But then he relaxed against the counter. It ain't possible, he murmured. What ain't possible? However, I'm going to go and hang around. Gents, I got a crazy idea. He had no sooner started towards that door than he seemed to gain surety out of the motion. It's him, he cried. He turned toward the others, white of face. Come on, all of you. It's him. It's Barry. But in the meantime, Harry had gone on swiftly to the office of the sheriff with Joe Cumber. Behind him swirled the curious crowd, and for their benefit he asked his questions loudly. Partner, that was sure a pretty play you made. I've seen 'em all try out to crack them balls, but I ain't never seen none of 'em do it the way you did, with your gun in the leather at the start. What part of the country might you be from? The other answered gently. Why, from over yonder. The T.O. outfit, huh? No, beyond that. Up in the Gray Mountains, that's so? I suppose you've been on trails like this before. Nothing to talk about. There might have been a double meaning in his remark, and Harry looked twice to make sure that there was no guile. Well, here we are. He threw open a door which revealed a bald-headed clerk seated at a desk in a little room. Billy, here's a gent that cracked it the first whack and started with his gun in the holster. By God, he's... Just kindly close the door, Harry, said Billy. Step in, partner. Give me your name. The door closed on the discomfited Harry, and Joe Cumber stood close to it, apparently driven to shrinking into the wall in his embarrassment. But while he stood there, his hand fumbled behind him and turned the key in the lock, and then extracted it. My name's Joe Cumber. Joe Cumber. This while inscribing it. Age? Well, about 32, maybe. Don't you know? Well, I don't exactly. His eyes were as vague as his words, gentle and smiling. 32, said Bill sharply. You look more like a 25 to me. Suppose we split the difference, eh? And with a grin he wrote, age 22 or 3. Business? I'm a trapper. Good. The sheriff's pretty keen for him. You gents in that game got a sort of nose for the trail, mostly. All right, Cumber, you'll see glass. He stood at the door. By the way, Cumber, is that straight about you starting your shot with your gun in the holster? I suppose it is. You suppose. Well, come on in. He banged once on the door and threw it open. Joe Cumber, Pete, and he drilled the ball starting his gun out of the holster. Here's his card. He closed the door, and once more the stranger stood almost cringing against it, and once more his fingers deftly turned the key, softly, silently, and extracted it from the lock. The sheriff had not looked up from the study of the card, for reading was more difficult to him than man-killing, and Joe Cumber had an opportunity to examine the room. It was hung with a score of pictures, some large, some small, but most of them were enlargements. It was apparent of Kodak snapshots, for the eyes had that bleary look which comes in photographs spread over 10 times their intended space. The faces had little more than bleary eyes in common, for there were bearded men and smooth-shaven faces, and lean and fat men. There were round, cherubic countenances and lean, hungry heads. There were squared, protruding chins. There were chins which sloped away awkwardly towards the neck. In fact, it seemed that the sheriff had collected 20 specimens to represent every phase of weakness and strength in the human physiognomy. But beneath the pictures, almost without exception, there hung weapons, rifles, revolvers, knives, placed crisscross in a decorative manner. And it came to Joe Cumber that he was looking at the galaxy of the dead who had fallen by the hands of Sheriff Pete Glass. Not a face meant anything to him, but he knew, instinctively, that they were the chosen bad men of the past 20 years. So you're Joe Cumber. The sheriff turned in his swivel chair and tossed his cigarette butt through the open window. What can I do for you? I got an idea, Sheriff, that maybe you'd sort of like to have my picture. The sheriff looked up from his study of the card, and having looked up, his eyes remained riveted. The other no longer cringed with embarrassment, but every line of his body breathed a great happiness. He was like one who had been riding joyously, with a sharp wind in his face. There was a distant rushing of feet, a pounding on the door of the next room. "What's that?" muttered the sheriff, his attention called away. "They want me." "Wait a minute," called the voice of Billy without. "I'll open the door. By God, it's locked." "They want me. 5'9" or 10, slender, black hair, brown eyes. Barry." "Glass, I've come for you. And I'm ready. And I'll say this." He was standing now, and his nervous hands were at his sides. "I've been hungering and hoping for this time to come. Barry, before you die, I want to thank you." "You followed me like a skunk," said Barry. "From the time you killed a hoss that had never done no harm to you. You got on my trail when I was living peaceable." There was a tremendous beating on the outer door of the other room, but Barry went on. "You took a gent that was living straight and you made a sneak and a crook out of him. And you sent him to double-cross me. You ain't worth living. You spent your life hunting men, and now you're at the end of your trail. Think it over. You're ready to kill again, but are you ready to die?" The little dusty man grew dustier still. His mouth worked. "Damn you," he whispered, and he went for his gun. It was out, his finger on the trigger, the barrel whipping into line when the weapon in Barry's hand exploded. The sheriff spun on his heel and fell on his face. 3 times as he lay there, dead in all except the instinctive movement of his muscles, his right hand clawed at the empty holster at his side. The 6th man had died for Grey Molly. The outer door of Billy's room crashed to the floor, and heavy feet thundered nearer. Barry ran to the window and whistled once, very high and thin. It brought a black horse racing around a corner nearby. It brought a wolf dog from an opposite direction. And as they drew up beneath the window, he slid out and dropped lightly, cat-like, to the ground. One leap brought him to the saddle, and Satan stretched out along the street. Chapter 28. The Blood of the Father. On the night of her failure at the cave, Kate came back to the cabin and went to her room without any word to Buck or Lee Haines. But when they sat before the fire, silent or only murmuring, they could hear her moving about. Whatever sleep they got before morning was not free from dreams, for they knew that something was impending, and after breakfast, they learned what it was. She struck straight out from the shoulder. She was going up to the cave, and if Dan was away, she would take Joan by force. She needed help. Would they give it? They sat for a long time looking at each other, and then avoiding Kate with their eyes. It was not the fear of death, but of something more which both of them connected with the figure of Whistlin Dan. It was not until she took her light cartridge belt from the wall and buckled on her gun that they rose to follow. Before the first freshness of the morning passed, they were winding up the side of the mountain. Kate a little in the lead, for she alone knew the way. Where they rounded the shoulder, the men reined the horses in which Kate had provided them, and sat looking solemnly at each other. "Maybe we'll have no chance to talk alone again," said Lee Haines. "This is the last trail either for Barry or for us. And I don't think that Barry is that close to the end of his rope. Buck, give me your hand and say goodbye. All that a man can do against Whistlin Dan, and that isn't much, I'll do. Having you along won't make us a whit different." "Thanks," growled Buck Daniels. "Just save that kind farewell till I show yaller. Hurry up, she's getting too far ahead." At the bottom of the ravine where they dismounted for the precipitous slope above, Kate showed her first hesitation. "You both know what it means?" she asked them. "We sure do," replied Buck. "Dan will find out that you've helped me, and then he'll never forgive you. Will you risk even that?" "Kate," broke in Lee Haines, "don't stop for questions. Keep on and we'll follow. I don't want to think of what may happen." She turned without a word and went up that steep incline. "What do you think of your soft girl now?" panted Buck at the ear of Haines. The latter flashed a significant look at him but said nothing. They reached the top of the canyon wall and passed on among the boulders. Kate had drawn back to him now, and they walked as cautiously as if there were dried leaves underfoot. She had only lifted a finger of warning, but they knew that they were near to the crisis. She came to that great rock around which she had first seen the entrance to the cave on the day before. Inch by inch, with Buck and Lee following her example, they worked toward the edge of the boulder and peered carefully around it. There opened the cave, and in front of it was Joan playing with what seemed to be a ball of gray fur. Her hair tumbled loose and bright about her shoulders. She wore the tawny hide which Kate had seen before, and on her feet, since the sharp rocks had long before worn out her boots, she had daintily fashioned moccasins, bare knees profusely scratched, bare arms rapidly browning to the color of the fur she wore. Haines and Buck had to rub their eyes and look again before they could recognize her. They must have made a noise, perhaps merely an intaking of breath, inaudible even to themselves but clear to the ears of Joan. She was on her feet with bright, wild eyes, glancing here and glancing there. There was no suggestion of childishness in her, but a certain willingness to flee from a great danger or attack a weaker force. She stood alert, rather than frightened, and with her head back as she skinned the wind to learn what approached. That ball of gray fur straightened into the sharp ears and the flashing teeth of a coyote puppy. Buck Daniel's foot slipped on a pebble, and at the sound, the coyote darted to the shadow of a little shrub and crouched there, hardly distinguishable from the shade which covered it, and the child, with infinitely cunning instinct, raced to a patch of yellow sand and tawny rocks among which she cowered, and remained there moveless. One thing at least was certain. Whistlin Dan was not in the cave, for if he had been, the child would have run to him for protection, or at least cried out in her alarm. This information Haines whispered to Kate, and she nodded, turning a white face toward him. Then she stepped out from the rock and went straight towards Joan. There was no stir in this little figure. Even the wind seemed to take part in the secret, and did not lift the golden hair. Once the eyes of the child glittered as they turned towards Kate, but otherwise she made no motion, like a rabbit, which will not budge until the very shadow of the reaching hand falls over it. So it was with Joan, and as Kate leaned silently over her, she sprang to her feet and darted between the hands of her mother and away among the rocks. Past the reaching hands of Lee Haines she swerved, but it was only to run straight into the grip of Buck Daniels. Now, up to that moment she had not uttered a sound, but now she screamed out, twisted in his arms, and beat furiously against his face. "Joan!" cried Kate. "Joan!" She reached Buck and unwound his arms from the struggling body of the child. "Honey, why are you so afraid? Oh, my baby!" For an instant, Joan stood free, wavering, and her eyes held steadily upon her mother, bright with nothing but fear and strangeness. Then something melted in her little round face, and she sighed. "Munner," and stole a pace closer. A moment later, Kate sat with Joan in her arms, rocking to and fro and weeping. "What happened?" gasped Haines to Daniels. "What happened to the kid?" "Don't talk," answered Buck. His face was gray as that of Kate. "It's Dan's blood." He drew a great breath. Did you see her try to bite me while I was holding her?" Kate had started to her feet, holding Joan in one arm and dashing away her tears with the free hand. All the weakness was gone from her. "Hurry," she commanded. "We haven't any time to lose. Buck, come here. No, Lee, you're stronger. Honey, this is your Uncle Lee. He'll take care of you. He won't hurt you. Will you go to him?" Joan shrank away while she examined him, but the instincts of a child moved with thrice the speed of a mature person's judgment. She read the kindly honesty which breathed from every line of Haines' face. She held out her arms to him. Then they started down the slope for the horses, running wildly for the moment they turned their backs on that cave. The same thought was in the mind of each. the same haunting fear of that small, shrill whistle pursuing. Half running, half sliding, they went down to the bottom of the gorge, while the pebbles they started rushing after them in a small avalanche, and they even had to dodge rocks of considerable size which came bouncing after. Joan, alert upon the shoulders of Lee Haines, she enjoyed every moment of it. Her hair tossed in the sun, her arms were outstretched for balance. So they reached the horses, climbed into the saddle. Then, without a word from one to the other, but with many a backward look, they started on the flight. By the time they reached the shoulder of the hill on the farther side, with a long stretch of downslope before them, they had placed a large handicap between them and the danger of pursuit, but still they were not at ease. On their trail, sooner or later, would come three powers working towards one end. The surety of Black Bart following a scent, the swiftness of Satan, which never tired, and above all the rider who had directed them both and kept them to their work. His was the arm which would strike from the distance and bring them down. They spurted down the hill. No sooner were they in full motion than Joan, for the first time, seemed to realize what it was all about. She was still carried by Lee Haines, who cradled her easily in his powerful left arm. But now she began to struggle. Then she stiffened and screamed, "Daddy Dan! Daddy Dan!" "For God's sake, stop her mouth or he'll hear," groaned Buck Daniels. "He can't," said Haines. "We're too far away, even if he were at the cave now. I tell you, he'll hear. Don't talk to me about distance." Kate reined her horse beside Lee. "Joan," she commanded. They were sweeping across the meadow now at an easy gallop. Joan screamed again, a wild plea for help. "Joan," repeated Kate, and her voice was fierce. She raised her quirt and shook it. "Be quiet. Munner, whip hard." Another call died away on the lips of Joan. She looked at her mother with astonishment, and then with a new respect. "If you cry once more, Munner whip." And Joan was silent, staring with wonder and defiance. When they came close to the cabin, Lee Haines drew rein. But Kate motioned him on. "Where to?" he called. "Back to the old ranch," she answered. "We've got to have help." He nodded in grim understanding, and they headed on and down the slope towards the valley. Chapter 29. Billy the Clerk. If Sheriff Pete Glass had been the typical hard-riding, sure-shooting officer of the law as is seen in the mountain desert, his work would have died with his death. But Glass had a mind as active as his hands, and therefore, for at least a little while, his work went on after him. He'd gathered 15 practiced fighters who represented, it might be said, the brute body of the law. And when they, with most of Rickett at their heels, burst down the door of the sheriff's office, found his body, they only had one thought, which was to swing into the saddle and ride on the trail of the killer, who was even now in a diminishing cloud of dust down the street. He was riding almost due east, and the cry went up, "He's streaking it for the Morgan Hills. Get after him, boys." So into the saddle they went with a rush, 15 tried men on 15 chosen horses, and went down the street with a roar of hoofbeats. That was the body and the muscle of the sheriff's work going out to avenge him. But the mind of the law remained behind. It was old Billy, the clerk. No one paid particular attention to Billy, but they never had. He was useless on a horse and ridiculous with a gun. The only place where he seemed formidable was behind a typewriter. Now he sat looking down into the dead face of Pete Glass, trying to grasp the meaning of it all. From the first he'd been with Pete. From the first the invincibility of the dusty little man had been the chief article of Billy's creed, and now his dull eyes, bleared with 30 years of clerical labor, wandered around on the galaxy of dead men who looked down at him from the wall. He leaned over and took the hand of the sheriff as one would lean to help up a fallen man, but the fingers were already growing cold. Then Billy realized for the first time that this was death. Pete Glass had been. Pete Glass was not. Next he knew that something had to be done. For what it was he could not tell, for he sat in the sheriff's office, and in that room he was accustomed to stop thinking and receive orders. He went back to his own little cubbyhole and sat down behind the typewriter. At once his mind cleared. Thoughts came and linked themselves into ideas, pictures, and plans. The murderer must be taken, dead or alive, and those 15 men had ridden out to do the necessary thing. They had seemed irresistible as they departed. Indeed, no living thing they met could withstand them, human or otherwise, as Billy very well knew, yet he recalled a saying of the sheriff, a thing that he had insisted upon. No man on no hoss will ever ride down Whistlin Dan Barry. It's been tried before, it's never worked. I've looked up his history, and it just can't be done. If he's going to be run down, it's got to be done with relays, like you're running down a wild hoss. Billy rubbed his bald head and thought, and he thought. With that orderliness which had become his habit of mind, from work with reports and papers, sorting and filing away, Billy went back to the beginning. Dan Barry was fleeing. He started from Rickett, and 9 chances out of 10 he was heading, eventually, towards those practically impenetrable mountain ranges where the sheriff before had lost the trail after the escape from the cabin, the killing of Matt Henshaw. Towards that same region again he had retreated after the notorious killing at Alder. There was no doubt, then, humanly speaking, that he would make for that same safe refuge. At first glance, this seemed quite improbable, to be sure, for the Morgan Hills lay due east, or very nearly east, while the place from which Barry must have sallied forth and to which he would return was somewhere well north of west, and a good 40 miles away. It seemed strange that he should strike off in the opposite direction. So Billy closed his eyes, leaned back in his chair, and summoned up a picture of the country. 5 miles to the east, the Morgan Hills rolled, sharply broken ups and downs of country, badlands really, rather than hills, and a difficult region to keep game in view. Now that very idea gave Billy his clue. Barry knew that he would be followed hard and he'd be followed fast, and he headed straight for the Morgans to throw the posse off the final direction he intended to take in his flight. In spite of the matchless speed of that black stallion, of which the sheriff had learned so much, he would probably let the posse keep within easy view of him until he was deep within the badlands. Then he would double sharply around and strike out in the true direction of his flight. Having reached this point in his deductions, Billy smote his hands together. He was trembling with excitement, so that he filled his pipe with difficulty. By the time it was drawing well, he was back examining his mental picture of the country. West of Rickett, about the same distance as Morgan Hills, ran the Wago Mountains, low, rolling ranges which would hardly form an impediment for a horseman, and across these Barry might cut at a pretty good speed on his western course, but some 15 or 20 miles from Rickett he was bound to reach a most difficult barrier. It was the Asper River, at this season of the year swollen high and swift with snow water, a rare feat indeed if a man could swim his horse across such a stream. There were only 2 places in which it could be forded. About 50 miles north and a little east of the line from Rickett, the Asper spread out into a broad, shallow bed. Its stream dispersed for several miles into a number of channels which united again farther down the course and made up that same strong river. Towards the ford, therefore, it was possible that Dan Barry would head in the region of Caswell City. There was, however, another way across that stream. Almost due west of Rickett, a distance of 15 miles, Tucker Creek joined the Asper. And above the point of junction, both the creek and the river were readily fordable, and Barry could cross them and head straight for his goal. It was true that to make Tucker Creek he would have to double out of the Morgan Hills and brush back perilously close to Rickett, but Billy was convinced that this was the outlaw's plan. For though the Caswell City fords would be his safest route if he would take him a day's ride on an ordinary horse out of his way, Besides, the sheriff had always said, Barry will play the chance. Billy would have ventured his life that the fugitive would strike straight for the creek as soon as he doubled out of Morgan Hills. Doors began to bang. 100 pair of boots thudded and jingled towards Billy. The noise of voices rolled the outer hall, poured through the door, burst upon his ears. He looked up in mild surprise. The first wave of Ricketts' men had swept out of the courthouse to take the trial of the fugitive or to watch the pursuit. In this second wave came the remnants, the old men, the women, the great-eyed children. In spite of their noise of foot and voice, they appeared to be trying to walk stealthily, talk so softly. They leaned about his desk and questioned him with gesticulations, but he only stared. They were all dim as dream people to Billy the clerk, whose mind was far away struggling with this problem. "Poor old Billy is kind of dazed," suggested a woman. "Don't bother him, Bud. Look here." The tide of noise and faces broke on either side of the desk and swayed off toward the inner office, and vaguely Billy felt that they should not be there. The sheriff's privacy. The thought almost drew him back to complete consciousness, but he was borne off from them again on a wave of study, pictures. Off there to the east went the 15 best men of the mountain desert, on the trail of the slender fella with the black hair and the soft brown eyes. Now he had seemed to shrink with aloofness, timidity, when he stood there at the door giving his name. It was not modesty. Billy knew now it was something akin to the beasts of prey, who shrink from the eyes of men until they are mad with hunger. And in the slender man, Billy remembered the same shrinking, the same hunger. When he struck, no wonder that even the sheriff went down. No wonder if even the 15 men were baffled on that trail. And therefore, it was sufficiently insane for him, Billy the clerk, to sit in this office and dream with his ineffectual hands of stopping that resistless flight. Yet he pulled himself back to his problem. Considering his problem in general, the thing was perfectly simple. Barry was sure to head west, and to the west there were only 2 gates, fording the creek and the river above the junction in the first place, or in the second place, cutting across the Asper far north at Caswell City. If he could be turned from the direction of Tucker Creek, he would head for the second possible crossing. And when he drew near Caswell City, if he were turned by force of numbers again, he would unquestionably skirt the Asper, hoping against hope that he might find a fordable place as he galloped south. But going south, he might be fenced again from Tucker Creek, and then his case would be hopeless and his horse worn down. It was a very clever plan, quite simple once it was conceived, but in order to execute it properly, it was necessary that the outlaw be pressed hard every inch of the way and never once allowed to get out of sight. He must be chased with relays. In ordinary stretches of the mountain desert, that would have been impossible. But the country around Rickett, it wasn't ordinary. Between the Morgan Hills and Wago, there were considerable stretches of excellent farmland in the center, of which little towns had grown up. Running north from the country seat, there were St. Vincent, Wago, and Caswell City. Coming south again along the Asper River, there were Ganton and Wilsonville, and just above the junction of the river with Tucker Creek lay the village of Bly Falls. There was no other spot in the mountain desert, perhaps, which could show so many communities. Also, it was possible to get in touch with the towns from Rickett, for in a wild spirit of enterprise, telephones had been strung to connect each village with the group. His hand went out mechanically and pushed in an open drawer of his filing cabinet, as if he were closing up the affair, putting away the details of his plan. Each point was now clear, orderly assembled. It meant simply chasing Barry along a course which covered close to 100 miles, which lay in a loosely shaped U. St. Vincent's was the tip of the eastern side of that U. The men of St. Vincent's were to be called out to turn the outlaw out of his course towards Tucker Creek. And then as he struck northeast toward Caswell City, they were to furnish the posse with 15 fresh horses, the best they could gather on such short notice. Swinging north along that side of the U, Wago would next be warned to get its contribution of 15 horses ready, and this fresh relay would send Barry thundering along toward Caswell City at full speed. Then Caswell City would send out its contingent of men and horses and turn that fugitive back from the fords. By this time, unless his horse was better winded than any of Billy's had ever dreamed of, it would be staggering at every stride, and the fresh horses from Caswell City would probably ride him down before he'd gone 5 miles. Even in case they failed in this, there was the little town of Ganton, which would be ready with its men and its mounts. Perhaps they could hem in the desperado from the front and shoot him down there as he skirted along the river. At the worst, they would furnish the fresh horses, and the 15 hardy riders would spur at full speed south along the river. If again by some miracle the black stallion lasted out this run, Wilsonville lay due ahead, and that place would again give new horses to the chase. Last of all, the men of Bly Falls could be warned. Bly Falls was a town of size, and it could turn out enough men to block a dozen Dan Barrys, no matter how desperate. If he reached that point, he must turn back. The following posse would catch him from the rear, and between 2 fires he would die ingloriously. Taking the plan as a whole, it meant running Barry close to 100 miles with 6 set of horses. It all hinged, however, on the first step. Could the men of St. Vincent turn him out of the western course and send him north toward Caswell City? If they could, he was no better than a dead man. All things favored Billy. In the first place, it was still morning, and 8 hours of broad daylight would keep that fugitive in view every inch of the way. In the second place, much of the distance was cut up by the barbed wire fences of the farmlands, and he must either jump these or stop to cut them. A crackle of laughter cut in on Billy the clerk. They were laughing in that inner office where the sheriff lay dead. Blood swept across his eyes, set his brain whirling, and he rushed to the door. "You yelping coyotes," shouted Billy the clerk. "Get out! I got to be alone. Get out, or by God..." It was not so much his words or the fear of his threats, but the very fact that Billy the clerk, harmless, smiling old Billy, had burst into noisy wrath scared them as if an earthquake had gripped the building, and they went out sidling and left their room in quiet. Then Billy took up the phone. "Pete Glass is dead," he was saying a moment later to the owner of the general merchandise store at St. Vincent. "Barry came in this morning and shot him. The boys have run him east to the Morgan Hills. Johnny, listen hard and shut up. You got half an hour to turn out every man in your town. Ride south till you get in the hills on a beeline east of where Tucker Creek runs into the old Asper. Do you hear? Then keep your eyes peeled to the east and watch for a man on a black hoss riding hard, because Barry is sure as hell going to double back out of the Morgan Hills and come west like a scared coyote. The posse will be behind him, but they most like will be a hell of a ways to the bad. Now, Johnny, everything hangs on your turning Barry back. And have 15 fresh hosses, the best St. Vincent has, so that the boys in the posse can climb on 'em and ride hell-bent for Wago. Johnny, if we get him started north, he's dead. And if you turn him like I say, I'll see that you come in on the reward. Do you hear?" But there was only an inarticulate whoop from the other end of the wire. Billy hung up. A little while later, he was talking to Wago. "Well, gosh, they got him on the run, and they got a heck of a plan. But now we're talking about Whistlin Dan Barry. I think he can outrun him. What do you think? Stick around. Next week we'll find out. Till then, have a good time. Be good. This is Clay Steele.